I want to wrap up my video now dealing with the no connection between Daniel chapter 8 and chapter 9, and remind the viewer and SDA members that this is a non-issue, because Seventh-day Adventists have misinterpreted Daniel 8:14. What some people don't know is that the reason that verse is so important for them is because, first of all, we know they've changed evenings and mornings to the word day, and the word day then to years, but they didn't have a starting point for it. You see, that was William Miller's, Ellen White's, and other early pioneers. They didn't have a starting point for this. So rather than seeing that Daniel chapter 8, that vision that ended in 8:26, they jumped over to chapter 9 to try to make a connection. And if you will read at the beginning of chapter 9, any scholar with any credibility whatsoever sees that Daniel chapter 9, Daniel is dealing with the 70 years of captivity. If you remember, the Judea went into captivity in 605 BC, and Jeremiah in chapter 25 had predicted that they would be in captivity for 70 years. And Daniel was familiar with that, apparently, and was wondering when that captivity was going to end. He knew it was nearing the time for it to end, and he wanted to know. And so that's what he's praying about as you start chapter 9. So it has nothing whatsoever to do with chapter 8. Daniel is talking about the 70 years of captivity, not 2,300 evenings and mornings of Daniel chapter 8. We're talking we're way down the road 12 years or so by now. And so that's why they want to make that connection, to try to take that 2,300 evenings and mornings and somehow connect it to the prophecy of Daniel chapter 9, when there's absolutely no connection whatsoever. And that is their Achilles heel, because they never interpreted Daniel chapter 8 verse 14 right. And if you'll notice, Dario again didn't mention 8:14 and try to interpret the word day, because he knows that the word day is not in the original Hebrew. It's evenings and mornings. But I want to go to some of the Seventh-day Adventist writers themselves. There was a man by the name of Raymond Cortell, who was the editor of the Seventh-day Adventist Bible Commentary. And he had a problem with Daniel 8:14 that arose over a kind of a contention between he and Dr. Donald Barnhouse. And Dr. Barnhouse committed comments that the investigative judgment idea was does not have Bible text support to it whatsoever. But after laboring over Daniel 8:14 using the original language and the historical grammatical method of interpretation, Cottrell found that he could not substantiate the Adventist position either on Daniel 8:14. So at the suggestion of a man by the name of F.D. Nichols, he sent a questionnaire to about 27 leading Adventist scholars and found that they too had no adequate defense, or no adequate Bible defense, for the SDA's interpretation of 8:14. In other words, they couldn't defend changing days to years when it should have been evenings and mornings to start with. So they concluded they had no Bible defense for it. Some of those did express that Daniel 8:14 had nothing to do with its context, and that because of the inaccurate word, the inaccuracy of the word cleanse there, which led the pioneers to connect Daniel 8:14 to the cleansing of the sanctuary in Leviticus 16. It was simply an accident that they did that, but they were trying to show that there was absolutely nothing to connect Daniel 8:14 to the cleansing of the sanctuary in Leviticus 16. Shortly after this, a committee was formed by the General Conference, and they met for a period of about 5 years and could never resolve the issue of Daniel 8:14 and how SDA interpreted it. While some did admit that the Adventist position could not be proven from the Bible, listen to this carefully. The majority wanted to solve the problem by ignoring the context and the language altogether. That's really some way to arrive at an interpretation, isn't it? listen to this conference that was held for 5 years, where they could not resolve nor prove from the Bible that the position of the Seventh Adventist was legitimate. The majority of those scholars simply tried to solve the problem by ignoring the context and the language of the Bible altogether. That speaks volumes about the deceptions of the Seventh Adventists. And at that meeting, Cortrell declared that despite exhaustive efforts, he could not prove the SDA's view of the Bible. Now remember, this is a Seventh Adventist scholar himself. At that meeting where all those people were together, after he had exhausted his efforts, he could not prove the SDA views from the Bible. And a man by the name of Don Newfield of the Adventist Review had reached the same conclusion. Cortrell does not want to abandon the traditional teachings of his church. In fact, he desperately wishes to retain it. He wants to keep that position. But he can't do it now because he believes it's solely interpreted on what Ellen White had to say. There's how these people are tied to Ellen White so much that the majority of the scholars wanted to totally ignore the text and the language altogether simply because Ellen White said it has to be this way. Later on, and remember now, Cortrell is the editor of the SDA Bible commentary at this time, and he's trying his best to put it together where it can be believable for people, at least give them some explanation. But he's in 1858 at the Review and Hell Publishing Association needed new printing plates for the classical book reading. At it was decided to revise it where necessary to agree with the commentary. In other words, they want to get everything in line here so if people read it, they would all agree. Once again, Cortrell is faced with this Daniel chapter 8. Coming again to the book of Daniel, determined he once again tried one more time to find absolutely faith to both Daniel and the traditional SDA interpretation of 8:14. But again, he found it impossible. He says, I then formulated 6 questions regarding the Hebrew text of the passage and its context. He submitted them to many college teachers versed in Hebrew and other leading religious departments throughout North American colleges, and these people are all his friends. Without exception, they replied, there is no linguistic or contextual basis for the traditional interpretation, Adventist interpretation of Daniel 8:14. I don't know how much more clear it can be the deceptions that the Seventh Adventists go through to hide the false prophecies of Ellen White. The majority of the scholars in the Seventh Adventist wanted to ignore the context and the language altogether and just go with what Ellen White had said, knowing they regarding the Bible, knowing they regarding the way it should be interpreted. And Cortrell finally concluded that without exception, after he had written all these people versed in the Hebrew language, they all applied to him that there is no linguistic or contextual basis for the traditional Adventist interpretation of Daniel 8:14. Could it be any more plainer than that? Of course, I'm not expecting Seventh Adventists to believe truth. They've ignored it this long, and the members have been brainwashed so much that truth is irrelevant to them. It's how can we protect Ellen White? Seventh Adventist members owe it to themselves to look for truth. You say you're people of the Bible, but yet here you have the majority of your scholars wanting to ignore the Bible and go along with Ellen White, that can find no way to connect Daniel 8:14 with 2,300 years, because they knew it was evenings and mornings, and they knew that it was then impossible to connect it to chapter 9 because it had been misinterpreted. And so now lay to rest the false notion that there's any connection between chapter 8 and chapter 9 of Daniel from the lips of the Seventh-day Adventist scholars themselves. Until next time, this has been Golly saying, God bless.